I'm Dr. Serena Higgins, and I want to talk to you today about C.S. Lewis's writing style. I'm just going to look at a few aspects of his technique and show you how he accomplishes what he does in these few areas of his mode of writing. I'm not going to do an evaluation, a critique, an analysis. I'm just going to present a few elements of his technique for your consideration. And the three that I want to talk about today are streamlined syntax, simple, vivid diction, and apt analogies. So let's look at a few examples. This is from Letters to Malcolm, chiefly on prayer. This is a book in which he writes letters back and forth with an imaginary correspondent. So let's take a look at the underlined paragraph here. When I spoke of prayer without words, I don't think I meant anything so exalted as what mystics call the prayer of silence. And when I spoke of being at the top of one's form, I didn't mean it purely in a spiritual sense. The condition of the body comes in, for I suppose a man may be in a state of grace and yet very sleepy. What I want to look at here is his streamlined, simple, straightforward syntax. He's not writing extremely complicated Miltonic sentences. The sentences are fairly straightforward. But this doesn't mean that they're boring. It doesn't mean that they all follow the same structure by any means. He starts out with various subordinate phrases and clauses. He changes up the order in which he introduces things, but he's also fairly casual with his syntax. Take a look at the second sentence. Begins with and. He doesn't follow any of this stuffy nonsense about using Latin grammar rules in English. He's perfectly fine starting with and to create this conversational, casual tone. And take a look at the balanced nature of this last sentence in the first paragraph. The condition of the body comes in. Very simple, straightforward language, and the sentence is just proceeding step by step without a lot of flowery embellishments. Semicolon, for, I suppose, a man may be in a state of grace and yet very sleepy. So the I suppose interrupts the main flow of the sentence. And it shows that the second part is an addition to the first part, for, because. Okay, here's a thing that could happen. But the main core of the clause is really simple. A man may be in a state of grace and yet very sleepy. It's also kind of funny. And the humor comes into the syntax as well as anything else because you've got the longer part of the sentence and then the sort of punchy, very sleepy. So keep those ideas in mind about streamlined syntax as we look at a couple of other examples. Here's one from his academic writing, from his scholarly prose that I thought I would share. This is from The Discarded Image, and he's writing about these mysterious creatures, these neutral spiritual beings that are neither angels nor demons that crop up all the time in medieval literature. He says he's written about these creatures, the Longavi, in a separate chapter because their place of residence is ambiguous between air and earth. So what I want you to notice here is that even though he's addressing a scholarly audience, his syntax is still streamlined and clean. Whether they are important enough to justify this arrangement is another question. So you see the vocabulary is slightly heightened from the familiar colloquial letters to Malcolm, but the sentences themselves are built in a very straightforward fashion. They are marginal, fugitive creatures, he says. Quite a short sentence. Subject, verb, and then these additional describers. Marginal, fugitive. He uses there what's called a syndeton. He leaves out the conjunction. By strict grammatical rules, it should say they are marginal and fugitive creatures. But it sounds better to leave out the conjunction and just say marginal, comma, fugitive. It speeds up the end of the sentence there. He goes on there, perhaps the only creatures to whom the medieval model of the cosmology, does not assign, as it were, an official status. Still a very straightforward they are sentence, but with a little more complexity coming at the end of it. Herein lies their imaginative value. I like the word herein as a transition, as a connector. It's slightly formal, but it packs a lot of meaning right into it. It says all this stuff I've already been talking about, those are the qualities from which they derive their imaginative value. And then the next two sentences are also very straightforward syntax. They soften, they intrude, but then the last one becomes a little more complex just to infuse sort of the beauty of what it's talking about. These beings, these neutrals, intrude a welcome hint of wildness and uncertainty into a universe that is in danger of being a little too self-explanatory, too luminous. There's that asyndeton again at the end, the leaving off of the and. And the sentence gets just a little more wild as it's talking about wildness, but it's still built in a simple way. Phrase attached to a phrase, attached to a phrase, attached to a phrase. So that's streamlined syntax. Now I want to talk about vivid, memorable diction. So the choice of words that's designed to bring something to life and to stick into our heads. But that doesn't mean it's always flowery diction. Let me show you what I mean. This is from his address on learning in wartime as contained in the collection The Weight of Glory. He's talking about how humans always try to do art and philosophy and beautiful things no matter what their circumstances, even if they are in wartime. And he says that humans are different from insects. They propound mathematical theorems in beleaguered cities, conduct metaphysical arguments in condemned cells, make jokes on scaffolds, discuss the last new poem while advancing to the walls of Quebec, and comb their hair at Thermopylae. This is not panache, it is our nature. So look at the word choice that he uses here. He uses precise choices of vocabulary to conjure images and emotional states. He's aware of denotation, which is dictionary definition, connotation, which is emotional baggage, and then also images and allusions, pictures and references packed into words. So beleaguered cities is just the word he wants. It's not exactly the same as besieged. It kind of includes being under attack and being besieged and maybe being other problems like under a quarantine because of a plague, for instance. So cities that are beset by huge catastrophes and crises. Conduct metaphysical arguments in condemned cells. That's an interesting one. The cell isn't condemned. The prisoner in the cell is condemned. But we easily make that imaginative leap, and it sounds good to have condemned cells next to each other there. It's a visual alliteration, even though it's not an auditory alliteration. Discuss the last new poem while advancing to the walls of Quebec. Advancing suggests movement, and so it's a vivid active verb. What do you think then about panache, especially in italics? It's a bit of a fancy word, right? But he's saying it's not the fancy thing. It's not panache. We're not putting it on the way it's somewhat pretentious for him to put on the word panache. So he uses the word to enact what he wants. Okay, let's look at another example of some rather vivid, memorable diction. I want to share one from the Screwtape letters. So the patient has started going to church, and Screwtape is telling his nephew Wormwood how to use this to his diabolical advantage. When the human goes inside the church, he sees the local grocer with a rather oily expression on his face, bustling up to offer him one shiny little book containing a liturgy which neither of them understands, and one shabby little book containing corrupt texts of a number of religious lyrics, mostly bad and in very small print. When he gets into his pew and looks around him, he sees just that selection of his neighbors whom he has hitherto avoided. And then further down, he goes on to describe some of these neighbors. One of them might sing out of tune, or have boots that squeak, or double chins, or odd clothes. And the point here is to make the man think subconsciously that Christianity is ridiculous. But what I want to focus on here is the word choice. Look at the vivid sensory vocabulary he has chosen. Oily expression on the grocer's face. That's really a neat choice because it makes something very physical and vivid that mightn't be, because it might be really the grocer's mannerisms or attitude that's oily. But when he says the expression is oily, it makes it very visual and vivid. And right there, a shiny little book, a shabby little book, corrupt texts in small print. So he's using these sensory words to put us in this situation. And anyone who has ever attended church can imagine just this situation or remember it. And then when he's kind of mocking the neighbors, again, sensory vocabulary. When the neighbor sings out of tune or has boots that squeak or double chins or odd clothes. And the word odd has a rather odd sound that pops out of the fabric of the sentence there. So it makes it that much more vivid. And on this point of memorable diction, I want to close with a selection from Perelandra. And I could have chosen any number of things because the first third or so of this book is absolutely rich with luscious, vivid description. So here, our main character, Ransom, is hungry and he's found this sort of fruit or vegetable, this sort of plant, and he's wondering if it's good to eat. The rind was smooth and firm, and his finger slipped through it. After a moment's hesitation, he put the little aperture to his lips. He tasted it. Um, it was like discovery of a totally new genus of pleasures, something unheard of among men, out of all reckoning, beyond all covenant. For one draught, for one sip, for one taste of this on earth, wars would be fought and nations betrayed. It could not be classified. He could never tell us, when he came back to the world of men, whether it was sharp or sweet, savory or voluptuous, creamy or piercing. So it's interesting that what we've got here is a description that isn't a description. It's an anti-description, right? It's saying all the things that it wasn't. But by saying those words, Lewis evokes in us our memories of things that do taste sharp or sweet, savory or voluptuous, creamy or piercing. And even some of those words are themselves metaphorical or metonymic, not literal descriptions. And so they give us the sense that the taste of this fruit was glorious, was rich, was multifaceted, and extremely delicious and satisfying. So then I want to close with the third point for today, which is apt analogies. One of the skills for which Lewis is known is picking the good comparison. I don't know if I've picked the absolute best ones here today for this example, but I think that they will do. In The Great Divorce, a character is complaining, and the angelic being that has met him says to him that hitherto you have experienced truth only with the abstract intellect. I will bring you where you can taste truth like honey and be embraced by it as by a bridegroom. Your thirst shall be quenched. Again, it's a metaphor, right? The idea of encountering truth as being a quenching of thirst. But what I want to look at is the apt analogy, that the taste, the experience of encountering truth is like tasting honey, sweet, a little sharp, very distinctive, very memorable, very pleasurable. And it's like being embraced by a bridegroom. So he's suggesting there that an encounter with truth is as overwhelming and ecstatic as a sexual encounter on a wedding night. So it's a very powerful analogy. And then he comes back to the thirst shall be quenched analogy again to kind of frame that little section. Mere Christianity is famous for being full of memorable analogies, and here's one. He's talking about the fact that, in his opinion, our culture, his culture at the time, has gone wrong as regards sexuality, that he thinks our sexuality has gotten very corrupted. And so he compares it to the following. What if there were a country that had striptease acts for food? Suppose you came to a country where you could fill a theater simply by bringing a covered plate onto the stage and then slowly lifting the cover so as to let everyone see, just before the lights went out, that it contained a mutton chop or a bit of bacon. Would you not think that in that country something had gone wrong with the appetite for food? Obviously, the analogy is that in a culture that has a striptease act, something has gone wrong with the appetite for sex. But that is a very vivid and memorable analogy. The idea of slowly uncovering a platter of food to tantalize our taste buds. And then A Grief Observed, with which I'll close, begins with an extremely memorable line. And it's a comparison, it's an analogy. No one ever told me that grief felt so like fear. I am not afraid, but the sensation is like being afraid. And okay, we know what being afraid feels like, but he goes on to give us these physical details in order to bring that analogy to life more. The same fluttering in the stomach, the same restlessness, the yawning. I keep on swallowing. An interesting observation there. I haven't really noticed the swallowing and the yawning in myself when I'm afraid, but it is a thing that happens. And it even happens in some animals as well. If you see a dog yawning in a packed room. It's a stress response in the animal. So the fluttering in the stomach, the restlessness, the yawning, these are physical manifestations of fear. And he discovered that they're also physical manifestations of grief. And he goes on with another comparison. At other times, it feels like being mildly drunk or concussed. There is a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. That is absolutely accurate. Grief, fear, trauma, extreme depression, they put this sort of woolly barrier between us and the world so that our senses are dimmed and dulled and we're not getting a clear connection. Our sensory data is not coming in as clearly as before, and there's a sort of a weightiness to it. So it's a very apt analogy, and he makes many other apt analogies throughout his writing. So those are just three things that I wanted to point out: his streamlined syntax, his simple, vivid diction, and his apt analogies. There may be others. So maybe you can comment below with some other points or some questions, or if you want me to discuss something similar with another writer, please let me know. Thank you very much for tuning in.